Hey folks, hope all is well. I read a book recently I'm dying to talk about, and it is Perfection by Vincenzo Latronico. I am going to have some spoilers in this one, but I'm going to start with essentially who this book is for, because I think it is actually for a lot of different people. So, who is this book for? People who have ever worked remotely before, people who have used or interacted with the world through social media, people who have lived or worked for an extended period of time away from their native country or have considered an expat lifestyle. I know that's very, very popular and becoming more and more popular these days. People who want to read a book with a fundamentally unique narration. This is a very, very different book, different than other novels I've read just because of how it's written and how you read it. And we can actually get into that. So let's actually get into the book. So what is it about? So it's about two digital nomads, this expat couple, Tom and Anna. You never really know where they're from, but you hear they're from Southern Europe, and they've been living in Berlin. They basically have one of these digital creative lifestyles. You don't know whether they're like well, you kind of do know. They essentially do brand strategy stuff, designing websites, designing pages, designing advertisements for their clients, and they basically jump from client to client doing different things. These are folks, even in the text they describe it as people that came of age with the internet, so they were adjusting sites on GeoCities and using Photoshop and doing things with websites. And so these are folks that have some sort of web and design fluency, and they've come to live in Berlin and have a very kind of comfortable lifestyle there. They essentially have a nice, beautifully aesthetic apartment. They have this large monstera plant, which is getting this really elaborate description in the early passages in the book. What else? They essentially work from home on the couch, sometimes other places, but in general they work from home remotely, and they both do the same thing, Tom and Anna, designing sites and landing pages. And there's even some tidbits there about doing the same types of fonts and doing the same types of styles that become quite trendy. So that happens quite a bit in their line of work. And I should say the whole narration here is actually third person, which is really unique because there's actually no dialogue. I've never read a novel with no dialogue, and that does take a little bit of getting used to, but you hear this narrator just telling you about their lives, and you're kind of getting a sense of what their day-to-day looks like and so on. And so what happens to Tom and Anna in Berlin? Well, they tend to meet their friends at galleries and coffee shops. They don't speak or really try to learn German, and so the tribe they build consists of mostly other expats that are exactly like them. They go to these galleries, they check out the art, they hang out in the evenings, sometimes they have dinners, and but essentially they're hanging out with the same type of people. And they're not really hanging out with people that are like native to Berlin or native to Germany in general, because of this kind of cultural differences connected to not knowing the language, and also connected to like the creature comforts that they become used to being the things that the other expats like to do. You can tell from the narrative that they get into Berlin at a time where they're essentially the early gentrifiers. I remember I studied abroad in Copenhagen, and there was a time when essentially I actually visited Berlin, and I was visiting one of my dad's friends in Berlin. He was an artist and so on. And it seemed to be like a really cool time to be there in the 2010s. But I've heard from a lot of people anecdotally. I haven't been back to Berlin. I've been to Germany since, but not to Berlin since the mid-2010s. That it's way more expensive now, and that a lot of the creatives are being pushed out. And I think in part it's because the cost of living has gone way up. So essentially, I feel like Tom and Anna are in the sweet spot where they don't really have to worry about that yet. They're in a really nice flat. They complain about the German bureaucracy in terms of getting a flat and getting set up with things. and it's something that they actually joke about with fellow expats, like, the German bureaucracy, it's so annoying. And actually, the author, Vincenzo, you can tell he's actually spent some time in Berlin, more than some, because the way he talks about streets and he uses German words, this Strasse and that Strasse, he talks about, there are these German words peppered through the text, which actually sort of convey somewhat of a fluency with German day-to-day life. So they have these expat friends, but they don't speak the language. They go to these galleries. They seem to have a really aesthetically pleasing lifestyle. And folks on social media are like, "Oh my God, your life looks amazing," and so on. But the more you read and the more you get a sense of their life, the more you realize that the things that were essentially really cool and attractive and just aesthetically pleasing, they kind of wear off. Things get a little bit old and stale. People that were coming to Berlin and spending time there, a lot of people, they leave and they're never to be spoken of again, and so their tribe is changing a little bit, and things get more expensive, and even their sex life gets boring, which is notable because in the book they actually do wind up going to a sex club at some point to sort of spice something up. And I think, that was maybe the main crux of a lot of the narrative, was like, at some point things got a little stale. So, of course, you have their love life got a little stale, but also what they were living for, what they were working for, these aesthetics that seem really attractive on the outside or, from a distance, actually weren't so cool, and they don't have staying power ultimately. And so they try to find things to kind of create meaning. There's a migrant crisis that eventually comes up, and this is, true to life, right? There was a migrant crisis in Europe. There are a lot of folks escaping war-torn areas in Africa and parts of Asia, and they're coming to Berlin, and there's all of a sudden a need for people to be useful and to be helpful. And Tom and Anna are digital nomads or digital expats, so they're supposed to be able to be really helpful and create web design pages and get people, help people find information and so on. But their connection to being helpful is actually limited because they don't speak German, and they can only do so much to help people that are trying to kind of find their way through that migrant crisis. They also spend some time in Lisbon. They actually elect to give up their apartment, or not give it up, essentially Airbnb it, have a short-term rental, and go to Lisbon and be in a new environment to spice something up. Because Berlin is getting a little bit dry, and that doesn't really solve the problem either. They wind up going to Lisbon because they have a client that is opening a new hotel or something along those lines, and they get a deal where they can spend a few months in Lisbon for relatively cheap in a new property, a new area, and it seems very exciting. And as soon as they get there, it turns out the room that they have is actually really not great. The bed is creaky. The environment that they are stepping into is actually not at all match the aesthetic that they want. And they're like, "Oh snap! We have to actually spend a few more months here," which is like a disaster. It's like every traveler's disaster, where it's like it doesn't match the brochure. Whatever they were planning to step into does not match the brochure. So that was a bit of an alarming scenario for them. And ultimately, whatever they captured in the Berlin aesthetic, it was like they were in love with this aesthetic of like post-Berlin Wall falling and like all the cool warehouse gallery art vibe, and this Strasse and that Strasse and this coffee shop and that coffee shop and that gallery and this gallery. They basically romanticized this type of lifestyle that ultimately proved to not be particularly sustainable. There are other things that went on there in that time. They were essentially saving up money, doing a really big important job, thinking that maybe they would create their own. They'd take this money and then build something really more sustainable and bigger, instead of being like a gig to gig type of instead of being gig to gig type of people, and ultimately their plans for that fell through, which is another emotional letdown in their relationship. And I think again there was this prevailing search of meaning and just purpose through, even though the aesthetics looked amazing. Like if you were someone that was looking at them back home, again, they're somewhere from Southern Europe, but you never are told where in particular they're from. But let's say they're from Spain or somewhere. Well, those folks are probably like, wow, this looks so amazing. They're living so well, etc., etc. But really, you see what the narrator gives us, what Vincenzo gives us, is this lens into their lives where it's like, actually, it's not that great. So, yeah, it was really remarkable to just see that journey and see sort of how things, start off really amazing and aesthetically pleasing, and they kind of wear off a little bit, and then it gets, progressively a bit worse, to the point that at some point they're no longer really able to afford their expenses, even in Berlin, in the same way, because Berlin's gotten way more expensive. It's no more, they didn't get in, they're no longer early gentrifiers that are enjoying those creature comforts. They're actually in the midst of, a situation where it's just really expensive to live now. And, even staying doesn't necessarily make sense given where their budgets are. So ultimately, they do wind up leaving. I don't remember if it's Tom or Anna, they have a relative that passes and they wind up inheriting some type of property or something, and I think they wind up opening, if I'm not mistaken, their own sort of like bed and breakfast type of place with the same type of aesthetics that they were essentially stepping into initially and they built out in their Berlin flat. So they tried to bring that back home, back to Southern Europe, and there was a lot of stress behind doing that, and the move, and saying goodbye, and imagining something new, and so on. And I think towards the end of the book, the thing that was really notable is they wind up finally opening this B&B type of situation. It's really stressful to do so. They have this weekend that seems pretty good, where the people really enjoy staying there and all this stuff. But ultimately, they wind up feeling really stressed out when that weekend is over, because they have to do this big cleanup after the debut of this place that they have now. And the thing that feels validating is when they finally get a digital review that says it's amazing, that the aesthetics are great, that they did a good job with it, and it like maybe gives them some energy to propel forward. But it's like, again, there's like a social media validation element to it that kind of justifies something that I think physically feels a little exhausting. So, what were my takeaways? Well, I had a few takeaways from this. One is that social media has distorted so much, right? And this is something we all kind of know these days. Essentially, the aesthetic that they cultivate isn't enough. Again, there's this talk about the Monstera plant in the flat, and there's such an aesthetic. It's sort of the ideal Instagram aesthetic that they're living in Berlin. How amazing is it to be a digital nomad with no real ties to society or even to an employer, right? Because you're jumping around doing different gigs constantly. But the truth is really you need to be rooted to something as humans, and you need to have a great cause or great meaning that fulfills your life and gives it purpose. And I think, again, the things that they projected and showed publicly just weren't enough. I keep going back to, like, there was this other dynamic where friends would comment on some of their pictures when they're traveling or when they're in Berlin and be like, oh my God, it's so amazing. The view's amazing. Looks like you're having so much fun. I'll definitely visit soon. And then they'd have these same people commenting on these posts, never actually visiting. And I feel like we've all seen that in some way, shape, or form, even if it's not in our lives directly, where someone's like, oh yeah, I'll do that thing, or this looks amazing, or whatever. And then that's where the beginning and the end of the connection really is. One other takeaway be a better expat. I really have considered, even for myself personally, traveling, living other places. I have lived in other places. I've lived in Denmark for an extended period of time. Sometimes I consider going back there. And when you're in a place for years, maybe, I mean, 6 months might not be a long time, 3 months might be a long time, but if you're living and or working in a place for, years, you should learn some of the language. You should learn some of the culture and engage with people that are actually from the place you're living in. And I think this is a really salient issue today. I mean, we're in a situation today where there's this phenomenon called geo-arbitrage, where you have Americans, for instance, American expats moving to places like Portugal, moving to places like Spain, and taking their American salaries and living like a 1%er essentially in a place that's way more affordable. And the issue with that is that, one, it drives up the prices locally for the people that actually live there. And two, a lot of the times they're not really connecting with excuse me, they're not really connecting with people that are on the ground, that are actually living there, because they're working remotely, digitally on their computers. And so their connection to the actual environments on the ground is in the coffee shops and these places that are curated in a way that is not truly social in the typical ways, where you're not coming across various social strata. You're basically coming across the same archetype of person. And so learning the culture, engaging with people that are from there, trying to learn the language a little bit, that's important, and not romanticizing everything. I think that so often people, travel other places and they're like, oh my God, this is so different than home. It's amazing, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes it is amazing. Sometimes it's just such a breath of fresh air from what you're used to. But a lot of times that kind of like that chill environment or that dynamic that you think isn't America, or that you think isn't the place that you're actually from, is not by design. Sometimes it's actually the product of government inefficiency and bureaucracy. Sometimes it's not actually a desirable thing, and for the people that are actually there. And I don't know, like, I just feel like romanticizing places has its limitations, because eventually you might become like Tom and Anna. Another thing I was thinking about a lot in the book was that trends are temporary. Find real meaning, right? Like, I think so often it's trying to find that aesthetic that's really cool, or living that particular lifestyle, and then trends fall in and out of fashion. So really finding meaning is really important. And I did find it notable that throughout their journey, I think, Tom and Anna are probably in their late 20s, maybe mid to late 20s when they start in Berlin. And by the time they leave, they're in their late 30s for sure. They're like approaching 40. And there was never a mention of kids. There was never a mention of anything else besides their stations. And I think the kids are not necessarily the be-all, end-all in terms of meaning. You can find meaning in other ways. But I did think that was notable, that was not ever a discussion for them. And I think the other thing that was really critical is that because they were working and doing the same line of work remotely, they were at home a lot in close proximity with one another. And I think I think about partnership a lot. And I do think it's not ideal to be with your partner all the time. So, all throughout the day, sometimes work is a nice bit of separation from that. And I think if you're both are on the couch working all day, then, after work, you're still on the couch together or going out somewhere. I think a few people probably can do that really gracefully, but I do think most people need some separation at some point. And I think they were together way too much. And they loved each other. This was not something where because their sex life became stale, they didn't love each other. They just was, they didn't have any personality beyond each other. And I think that's actually another thing that the third person really did, the third person narration did, is it kind of conveyed like, well, these people don't really have personalities besides what they're trying to project. And is that really who they are? You know, like that was something that definitely came up. And I think the last kind of takeaway is, again, find a tribe, develop your tribe, develop a tribe that's diverse if you can manage that, and really put yourself out there, even if it is uncomfortable to do so. I think that's at least how you have a better chance at really ingratiating yourself in a society that is not native to you. So, all right. Would I recommend this book? I would highly recommend this book. I loved it, honestly. I think it's so relevant for our time and for my life personally. I work remotely. I think a lot of people work remotely today, and it's just there are pros and cons to it, no doubt. You do have a lot more, mobility and freedom and some of those things. But at the same time, I think, having a tribe is really important, even as you travel. And it was not lost on me that they were there for Tom and Anna, that is, were there for so long, but had struggled to do that well. And that people that actually left Berlin were never really spoken of again. It just, they wound up not seeing them. It was like, oh, what happened to him, or what happened to her? It's like, oh, I heard they had a kid, or oh, I heard they were gone. And those type of relationships that are fleeting, that's tough. It is tough to really be in an environment where most of your relationships are fleeting. Some people like that, but as you grow older, I think that's harder to be in love with. And I will say, I mean, this world we're in these days has been really volatile, and I do think personally about, being in a place, moving and living in another place and exploring that. And, I'm a dual citizen, so it's something that I really do consider. So, so I would highly recommend Perfection. Please read it. If you read it or have read it, talk to me about it. Reach out, drop anything in the comments. And this was my first book review. Hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you again soon. Take care.